Welcome back to the Manage to Win podcast. Today's episode is sponsored by Habitly.com, where you can learn better soft skills. Build on your strengths. Hey, if you're good at achieving goals, I bet we've got something on Habitly where you can achieve goals even better. You're good at leading? Well, we've got leadership training. We've got how to run a meeting. By the way, those meetings suck up a lot of time. How'd you like to learn how to save time and get more out of your meetings? That's what we've got on Habitly.com. Check it out. Today's episode is with Jerome Deroy. He is part of Narativ. That's Narativ. He's all about storytelling. They've written a book, The Art of Storytelling. It's a whole systematic approach. He walks through it in 7 steps in the book. We were not that systematic in this podcast, but we had a great discussion, a lot of good examples about how you can tell effective stories about your business and what you're doing and the value you bring, and some of the challenges of getting there. Let's dive in. Jerome, I got a question for you. So when I was growing up, I was taught, David, storytelling is not a good idea. You must always tell the truth. So now you are an expert and you've written a book powered by storytelling. Why is storytelling good now? But when I was growing up, it wasn't always the best thing.
Yeah. It's funny because I grew up in France, and there's an expression which is raconter des histoires, and which is how you would say storytelling, but it has the connotation that you just explained right now, which is essentially I'm making stuff up. And so when I told my parents that, my father's the French part of my parents, and my mom's American, and so when I told my father that that's what I was going to do, he said, "That's strange. Why would you? Are you going to make up stuff?" And so I get where you're coming from, but somewhere along the way, there was more and more interest in trust and authenticity, especially on the part of businesses towards their customers and towards their employees, and leaders had to be able to show more and more of that, because there was a point at which we could tell when someone is not being authentic or truthful. And ironically, it's the stories that can back up where you're coming from. So if I come at you with statistics and data and even the values that I believe in, anyone can make up their own interpretation of those. But if I have a story that proves that these are the values that I live by, then I'm more likely to believe you. So ironically, we've kind of come full circle and done a 180 on that.
It's interesting the way you put that, because I think one of the challenges we've got is that, particularly in this social media environment, where so many quote unquote stories are based on partial truths and partial data and opinion or bias or bullying. Do you talk about that at all in your book or in your coaching, as far as the flip side? I think that, my impression from what I've seen in the book is that it's about how to be a good storyteller, but there's the flip side. How do you discern when someone is doing the older version of storytelling where they're embellishing, exaggerating, or playing with the facts?
Yeah. And, there's different kinds of storytelling. And, what we do at Narativ is we really focus on the personal experiences so that you can turn those into stories. And personal experiences, by definition, it's something that happened to you. And the other part of that definition is that it happened, right? So it's not something I'm making up. It has to be, we're very, very adamant about this. And that's what's in our book, is the way to tell a story is to answer the question, what happened? And you have to be super factual. If it's not about what happened, even if it's what you thought about what happened or what you felt about what happened, we actually ask people to take that out of the story. So I'll give you an example. One day I was working in, and this is true, this happened to me. I worked in finance at the beginning of my career. I went to business school. And then, I walked into my boss's office one day after 4 years of working there and said, "Lawrence, I quit." And he said to me, "Oh, don't tell me, I know exactly the reason you quit. You're going to go and work for another company, another bank that pays better than we do." And I said, no, that's not what I'm going to do. He said, oh, I know then. Don't tell me you're going to go and work for a consulting company like McKinsey and be, all those big ones. And because they pay better. And I said, no, that's not what I'm going to do. He said, well, I don't understand. What are you going to do then if you're not going to work in finance or consulting? I said, well, I'm not sure, but I know it's going to be creative and meaningful. Now, I give you that example because that is exactly what happened, right? You could see me walking into that office and saying the things I said, and you could hear what Lawrence, my boss, told in response. Now, before I learned how to tell a story that way, according to what happened, I would have probably said something like, I wasn't very passionate about my job, and I didn't quite know what I wanted to do, but I knew I wanted to do something creative. But, I really kind of liked the team that I was on and on. I could go about my feelings and my thoughts and what went into my decision-making process. But you as a listener are not learning anything specific about my experience that would make it unique in your mind, because my goal is to connect with you so that you can connect the dots and I don't have to do it for you. Whenever we put our feelings and thoughts and opinions, especially opinions and interpretations, then we get in the way of our audience being able to connect with you. So that's kind of fundamental to our storytelling, and why I always say it's not about making something up. It has to be about the truth of that experience you had.
It's interesting to me that in your example, when you told the story, you went step by step. There was like, I could follow the sequence. It was simple. It was straightforward. You didn't put much emotion in or anything like that, which is an option, I would think, but you're shaking your head no. But then when you went to the prior way of doing it, it was, and I'm type A, so it's like, I want to go from point A to point B in the shortest distance possible. The other way was more touchy-feely, like, kind of thinking blah, blah, blah. But as you kind of say, I didn't really feel I got from point A to point B. I got from point A and I landed in a swamp and I couldn't get out of it.
That's right.
What do you find that most business people or business leaders or companies, where they get stuck with the storytelling piece? I mean, you've written this book, StoryBrand has built a huge business on what they do. And there's really a need for people to be able to communicate what they do, how they do it, the value they deliver, or even to just connect better.
Yeah.
So,
I think for those business leaders, that swamp that you're talking about, I really resonate with it, because the problem or the challenge that people go through as leaders is they have their own sort of speak and their own jargon, which is, within the context of where they operate, which is their company. And so everyone within that company may or may not understand them. There's a pretty good likelihood that they will, because that's the language that was created as part of that culture. But the danger of that is that the minute you have new people coming in, or the minute that you have to reach out to external people that are not living within that culture, then you run the risk of having your kind of own echo chamber where you're sort of speaking this jargon, but you're not actually reaching anybody, because you've kind of lost sight of this really simple and straightforward way of connecting with people. And that's what stories should be. They should be a really simple and straightforward way to connect with people by just telling them the sequence of what they went through. And what we're not paying attention to when we're doing that is we're not paying enough attention to our listener and the way that people listen. What gets in the way of our ability to listen to somebody else? That swamp that you're talking about, that has everything to do with the listening, right? Because that was your analogy as a listener. Yeah, I got into that swamp and then I was stuck. And that's what many, many people feel when they're hearing some kind of communication, right? There's a point at which I'm with you, and then I'm no longer with you for whatever reason. And so we pay a lot of attention to what are those obstacles? What are the things that get in the way of people's ability to listen? And once I understand that, then I can create a story that's relevant to my listener. It's not the other way around. It's not me coming up with an incredible story and then saying, well, that's going to land because it's an incredible story. I have to do the work on my listeners first and sort of figure out.
So what are the typical things that people are listening for?
Well, if you're a buyer, you're listening for, what's this product going to do for me? How is this going to solve the challenges and problems that I currently have, right? So if you're the seller, then the story you have to tell has to be about those challenges, right? So the first thing you're going to be doing is you're going to be listening, right? And then you're going to see, okay, these are the problems and challenges. I've got a story for that. Instead of barging in with your story about the wonderful features and technology of your product, which we kind of tend to do when we've got something fantastic, but we haven't checked yet if that's going to land. So, that's one. I think for
can we paint a picture with that? Can you give me an example of that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I worked with a fintech company, and they had this really great product, actually. An app, like many apps exist around financials. And the idea was that rather than, if you think of Venmo or PayPal or these kinds of things that help us buy things a lot faster, well, they had done something that was more business to business. So if something happens in your home, let's say your water boiler, conks out, then you're going to go to your insurance company and see if you can get reimbursed, right? You'll file a claim. That's going to take a little while. And then it's going to take even longer to actually get the money once the claim's been approved, right? Well, this company, what they were doing, they were an intermediary, and they allowed the insurance company to pay that claim out within minutes. So you no longer had to wait for weeks. So what we did with that fintech company to represent this product, rather than going right to the solution, we said, well, what are the kinds of challenges here that you've lived in your life as the salesperson? And one of these salespeople talked about when she was in college, she'd just gotten married in her last year of college. Her husband was a teacher, and they had a small child. And that child needed diapers and all of the things that you need to care for a child. And one day, she was supposed to get a payment. She had an online business that put her through college, and she was supposed to get the payment from that. It was all on the website. And so, but it was a Friday. And so she learns that she's not going to get that payment until the next Monday. And that weekend, they had made plans to finally have a date night with her husband. And so she had to cancel the babysitter because she could no longer pay for that babysitter. And now she had to go to the grocery shop with her baby screaming and having to choose between diapers and food. So when she told that story, suddenly we all got, oh, okay, you were in big trouble at that moment because you couldn't get that money instantly. What's your product again? It's a product about getting money instantly. So now I'm much more able as a consumer and as the buyer of this product to get what's in it for me and what's in it for my own customers, right?
So the questions seem to be really important. But let me shift gears. So I work with a lot of people in the IT services space, and many of them do not articulate anything special. We provide great IT services is basically the message. Okay. So does a company have to have something special, something that really makes them stand out, or can they just tell stories that are, we provide great IT service?
I mean, yes, absolutely. That could be your pitch, and the proof is in the pudding, as they say. So once you start using our services, you'll see how great we are. The only issue with that is that there's a lot of other people that claim the same thing. And you could say this of any industry, right? Or any service. Yeah. And so if you do want to stand out, and in order to differentiate yourself, it really helps and it makes a difference to have a roster of success stories that can show me as a potential client what you've done for others successfully. And I don't mean here was the challenge that we saw, here's the solution we provided, but really put me in the shoes of those clients that you've helped before, because then I can make connections in my own mind. And when we're talking about IT services, I think it's really important to sort of have the end user in mind, right? So not just the client, but how did this change if you think of stories in general, they're about life-changing events. Those are the ones we gravitate towards, right? There's some kind of change. So you have to think about that change that you provided for clients. And once you've pinpointed what those changes are, then you can put that into a story that you tell to other potential clients.
And it seems like they get caught up in the technology side, whereas I'm constantly advising them to think about, you're really a business advisor. And you need to ask, like you brought up, good questions so that they talk about their business. Here's where we're hurting. This area is not profitable. This process takes too long, whatever it is. And then you can determine which of those are something that can be solved through the technology. But when you think about this before and after, where maybe a company was struggling to differentiate themselves, and then they were able to go through a process, and part of that process was coming up with a killer story. What's your favorite example that you've got there?
I worked with a big health insurance company, and this was right when the market was suddenly going to be open, with the Affordable Care Act and all of that. And so all these companies that have been around in this case, more than 100 years, they went through a kind of rebranding, and they sort of realized that simply saying, we've been around for 100 years, trust us, that doesn't work anymore. Because there's for every company that says that, there's 10,000 bloggers that find examples of why that's not true. And so now it's a very different environment. And so they had come up with these great, new branding attributes, and the whole goal, and I'm using their jargon here purposefully, is to be more customer centric. And they were like, we are customer centric. We think about our customers, but nobody knows that. And so we said, well, you have to prove that, right? And how do you prove that? You find the stories to prove it. And so we worked with them, and we asked them, where are the storytellers? Where are those stories that we can find that are going to prove this fact that you are customer centric? Because right now, I don't believe you. I have no reason to believe you. And they said, well, we've got all these attributes, the branding. Who? And they said, well, maybe the call centers, because they hear from our customers day in and day out. So maybe you should go there and see if we can find stories. And so we did. And there was one story that emerged, and this guy's name was Jose, and he was in Visalia, California. And I asked him, so what's the experience? And he said, well, I got a phone call one day from a woman named Mona, and she said, my husband's crazy. And so immediately he said, well, I've got a list of therapists and all that who can help with that. And she said, no, it's not that kind of crazy. And she moves to another room, and she said, he's watching his football game, so I'm going to another room. He's crazy because he refuses to get this CPAP machine that's going to help him with his sleep apnea. And I'm really worried. And so Jose then says, well, I happen to actually have sleep apnea, and I use such a machine. So maybe I should talk to him, and maybe I can convince him. And she says, well, he's watching his football game. He's not going to like it. But anyway, she shuffles through it. And as she's shuffling over there, she says, there's something else you should know. Henry, my husband, his father died of cancer. And in his dying days, he was on a respirator. And I believe that that's why Henry doesn't want to have this CPAP machine, because it reminds him of that respirator. And Jose said, okay. And then she said, here he is. And so Henry gets on the phone now, and Jose thinks on his feet, and he says, you're a football fan. And what game are you watching? He says, what's the Bears versus the Packers? And Jose says, oh, I'm a Bears fan. This is great. And Henry says, well, that's terrible because I'm a Packers fan. This is not a good way to start this conversation. Exactly. But then Jose tells Henry, look, you're a football fan. I am too. And I want to tell you about Reggie White, Football Hall of Famer, who died young in his 50s because of respiratory issues. If he'd had a machine like the one I use every day, by the way, for my sleep apnea, like you have, he would still be alive today. And so then they continue on this conversation. And finally, Henry says, you've convinced me, and I want to get back to my game. I'm going to do this, but I'm going to do it on one condition. And Jose tells him, well, is it because of the price? Because you're fully covered. I can tell you that right now. He says, no. I just need one thing for you to do. And he says, okay, I'll do anything. And he says, I need you to say right now, go, pack, go. And I'll get this machine. And then Jose took a beat and said, all right, I'll do it. Go, pack, go. And so that's the story he told. And that story that I just told you now, was on their internal channel, like a YouTube kind of channel. They've got, more than 50,000 employees all over. And it was their greatest engagement initiative. And people told stories as a result of seeing that. And then it even became the subject of an advertising campaign for that health insurance company. Something they would have not found even with the best and brightest creative agencies, right? Just because it followed those values, and it certainly showed you how customer-centric this company is.
It's kind of funny that it took somebody a little while there to say, oh, maybe you should talk to the people on the front lines. We're actually talking with customers if you want stories. It reminds me of the Dove advertising campaign where they used regular people to advertise their soap type of thing. It was just like,
And how long did that take? Right?
Yeah.
How long did that take to get to that? Right? So for these sort of model type looking to sort of thinking, well, hang on a second, who's our audience here? And that comes back to this fundamental principle, right? Is when you're telling a story, you're not thinking of yourself. And I mean, maybe you are, but you shouldn't be. You're thinking of your listener, and you want to be, and that's when you can tell the difference, right? Is someone who's really focused on their listener, their viewer, their reader. They're going to find a story that's going to connect with them. That's my only goal as a storyteller. It's not about telling the most incredible story with, the perfectly placed comma and all of that, or the perfect pause. It's not about that. It's about what does my listener want, need, or care about? And what's the story that I can tell that's going to make me care about those same things, right? That's the fundamental thing. And you can scale that. You can think of yourself as a company, even, what do we care about? What do we really care about? What do our customers really care about? Let's tell stories about that.
Well, I certainly agree that's important. But the other thing, if I go back to your questioning, is you have to take the time to understand, why is this person not making the decision?
Yeah.
So is it, I have no time? Is it, I have no budget? Is it, I don't have the facts, so I don't necessarily agree with the conclusion? Is it, what are these things? And you've really got to work with your people who are talking with your clients or prospective clients, day in and day out, or go out there and talk with them yourself, depending on the size of your company. So what about you're talking about these very large companies. What about if I'm like a 10, 20, 30 person company? Have you worked with any companies in that size where there's a story you can share with us where they were kind of, they were bumping along, and whether they were losing money or whether they were profitable, whether they were growing slowly, whatever, but where really understanding how to tell a story about their business, not only, like you said, help them engage with new employees they hired, but also help introduce themselves and create relationships more deeply with existing clients and then with new people.
Yeah, I do a lot of one-on-one coaching with entrepreneurs specifically. And I remember one a few years ago that came to me, and she'd just gotten a large kind of funding. And so for her, it was very large. It essentially meant that funding meant that she could focus on her startup idea for a whole year. She was going to be paid for a whole year, and she could just focus on it and build her team and then get more funding from there. And so she came to me at this very, initial set where she was essentially that first step. And she only had one other employee. And she said, these people gave me this funding, but they told me at the same time, you need to work on your story because data is not sexy. And that's what her company was all about, right? It was all about using data to improve the capacities of others. And so she says, what do I do? And so I said, well, how did this come about? What were the experiences that came to you? What was wrong that you saw? And then what was the solution that you found? Tell me about that experience, right? And she started to tell me about this. And this was all about improving, systems within the criminal justice system. So, in terms of making systems work better for prosecutors, judges, defendants, the whole thing. And so quite an ambitious thing.
Yeah, because the whole system's broken.
That's right.
Well,
and
not the whole system, but there is, and anyway, that's a whole nother topic of
Well,
That's a real big challenge she has.
And one of the things that she found is that some counties work really well, and the county next door, terrible, right? And so her simple idea was, well, why don't we look at what that county's doing well and tell the other county what they're not doing well, and that they maybe could use those same systems, because the fundamental problem is that there's no connection between any of these county systems, right? So that's what she was proposing. Let's create a system of checks and balances, essentially, that take the best ones and lift up the mediocre ones, right? And so how do you sell that, right? How do you pitch that with a story? And so she told stories because she went on a road trip to look at all of this in action and took lots of notes, even wrote a book about it. So when I learned about that, I was like, well, that's your story. You need to tell us about an experience that you had in one of these counties. And so she did, and very colorful people and judges in the South, et cetera. And so she had a great story. And then she went back and pitched the same people as she was growing her organization. And by the end of that pitch, when she told that story of Quitman County in Mississippi and how things were broken there, a couple of people raised their hands and said, how can we help? We got to help those people down there in Quitman County. But of course, what she was saying, just by being so specific about this one county and what was wrong with that, you could now see the bigger picture. And so now she's got an organization of 30 people. She went just from one woman company to 30. And now she's dealing with this other issue, which is, how do I onboard these new people into that same idea so that they can see the vision that I had 5 years ago in that Quitman County in Mississippi, because they didn't go through that, right? So how do we do that? And so the trick is to sort of democratize these stories. And essentially, she's become the chief storytelling person, but now she's got to find other people who can tell their own stories of why this system is broken and what this organization can do to help fix it.
So why, the concept of storytelling has been out for a while. Why aren't leaders doing this better?
Well, one is, it takes practice and it takes training. You do have to learn how to do this. It's not something that's so innate. That simple method of just sticking to the facts of what happened in your experience and sticking to the discipline of not putting in your own thoughts and interpretations and opinions about it, but rather showing, show, don't tell is kind of the simple premise. That takes a lot of work. It's almost like a new muscle at the gym that you're practicing. So number one is you have to take the time to practice. And number two is, I think a lot of leaders aren't necessarily aware of the impact that they're having when they're not telling the right stories or the relevant stories for their audiences. It takes a little while to come back to them, right? So there may be a lot of people in the front lines that are sort of seeing that, but then it takes a little, you sort of go to, especially if you're in a smaller organization, you sort of go to systems. And you go to, I need that person to do this job. I need this other thing to work better than the thing that I had before, right? And so we don't necessarily think about the stories as a top priority. And I think that's a fundamental mistake, right? Is that you have to sort of be able to tell stories that are going to attract the right people to you. Even when you're recruiting people, what's the story you're telling out there about this job that you're looking for,
And what about the concern that I'm going to spend this money, I'm going to spend this time, and it's really not going to make that big of a difference? You ever had a client like that you can tell us what happened?
Yeah, I definitely have had a client, few actually. And, it's interesting because, you get through it anyway, right? So they did become clients ultimately. But the number one kind of objection is sort of, if I can refine that definition a little bit from, I'm not sure it's going to work out. It's more like, I have a certain amount of funding and or budget for these kinds of things, training and coaching, et cetera. How do I know that this is going to provide me with a return on investment? When if I put people through a technical training, I know that they're going to do something technical better that they didn't know how to do before. So that's kind of easy, right? This is different because this is about mindset. It's about it's about communications and all of that. And so there was this client that came in, with that very objection, sort of like, I'm not sure, this is going to stick. And there's a lot of people in my organization, they're kind of cynical. Not me. Not me, by the way. I really believe in this. I think this is great. But I've got these two other leaders here that, that maybe for them, they're very data oriented. They need statistics and that sort of thing. And I said, well, let's talk with them. Those are the people we need to talk to. And so, in talking to people like this, you sort of quickly realize that there's a kind of an insecurity that's underlying this. Here's a skill that I know is a skill and I should have it, but do I have the time and is it going to bring back money? I'm not so sure about that. But really what's underlying this is, can I do this? Am I actually able to step into this role of a presenter, speaker, storyteller, spokesperson, ambassador, all these words that are used and can be quite intimidating. And so, with those people, what I did is that we started with just what's getting in the way for you, and let's kind of show you with some examples, real world examples, people who weren't such great storytellers. And then when they did start telling stories, how did that sort of move the needle? Like that story I told you about Jose, or the story I told you about the woman in fintech, right? These were not storytellers. These are not the great orators of our time. And once you start to dispel that myth that anybody can do this and you can tell a story, you just follow these steps and you'll get to it. Once they see that in action, they're like, okay, now I can see myself doing it. That's the big problem that underlies all of those questions around ROI. It's more about, can I really do this? And what if I don't? What if I embarrass myself? What if I make myself too vulnerable? Those are the real questions that come up when you dig under the surface a little bit.
So we're just getting rolling, and then I can go into my own company and that type of thing. But this is a great place to end it, because the audience, hey, how can you do this? Well, Jerome, how do they reach you to learn more about your process? And of course, your book, Powered by Storytelling, is on Amazon and everywhere else.
Yeah.
So, but how do they reach you to learn more and maybe have a conversation?
Yeah. So, the book is a great place to start, actually, because it's 7 chapters and each chapter is a step of our method. So when you go through this book, you'll actually have a really good sense of what this is and how you can do it yourself. So it's a great way to start. And it is powered by storytelling. You can find it everywhere you find books, Amazon included. But then there's our website, Narativ, which is spelled Narativ.com. So just one R, no E. And I would point people specifically to our blog page. We have regularly new articles that come out about all the issues that we just talked about in this interview and more. And also we have our own podcast called Leadership Story Talks, which you can find anywhere you find podcasts. And that's where we have guests that come in and talk about their own experiences around leadership and engagement and using storytelling, but also other techniques and strategies. So you can learn a lot through the book, the blog, and the podcast. I think those are great ways to get you going.
Fabulous. Well, thanks so much for being on the show. This has been great. I think it's really important tips for leaders out there to grow the business, engage with people better, build stronger relationships. So thank you so much. And you gave some great resources for people to check out.
Thanks, David. I really appreciate being here.
Thanks for tuning in today. If you liked the episode with Jerome, love to have you subscribe, leave us a comment or a rating. We always enjoy feedback. Don't forget our sponsor, Habitly.com, which will help you achieve what you really want to achieve. Be your best. Build your soft skills. Take the strong ones, make them stronger. Take the ones that aren't so strong, maybe even weak. Make them so they don't hurt you. Habitly.com. And thanks again for joining us. Stay tuned. We've got more great guests coming, but bye for now.